Hello, I'm Frank Conkling, and this is Panda Consulting's ArcGIS workshop. Today, we're going to look at dimensioning in the parcel fabric, and specifically, we're going to look at using labels for dimensioning. We're not going to talk about annotation, not even going to talk about labels on point feature classes, but we are going to talk about some of the built-in parcel fabric dimensioning that's in there, and we're going to explore how it works and why it works, and so that you understand all the little settings and the differences that it makes on there. Before we go into there, you'll see a QR code on the title page here. This actually is a link over to Panda Consulting. You can find out who we are, what we do, why we do it. You get links to register there, so please go over there and visit while you're at it. For those of you that are in here and are appearing live, just know that if you have any questions or comments or anything, please put them over in the chat window. Chris with Panda is here, and he's going to go and moderate it. So Chris will go and be watching that. So please, if you have any questions or comments that you might want to have addressed, go ahead and put them over there, and Chris will stop me from talking, and he'll put it up there. All right. So the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about some of the changes between ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro, and to help you understand a little bit more about how this works. And let's look at it by first going and exploring the actual COGO fields that are associated with line feature classes when you're in the parcel fabric. Now, some of the things you want to recognize is that, for example, inside of ArcGIS Pro, the biggest difference is that the COGO fields are no longer string fields. They no longer store the value that's going to get displayed. Rather, what they do is they store a numeric value on here. And that numeric value then, depending upon how you want it to be displayed and on the labels and such, you actually have to go through an expression to go and have it appear as you wish it to be. Same way with right now, for example, on here, I can see that this distance field here, this distance field, if I go into the data designer and look at it, I can tell it how many decimal places I want. So I could go down to 2 decimal places. I could tell it that I wanted to go and have thousands. I wanted to have padded with zeros. I could even give it a suffix on here and say, what is the suffix that I want on here? And when I go and save this out and go to and bring up my attribute table, all right, when I bring up my attribute table, it will then go and show me that value. And here I'm going to back over here as being the decimal places and the suffix on the end of them. What you want to remember, though, is that it's only for being displayed back to you while you're interacting with that data in the actual software. It is not the configuration that you used for expressions or calculations or anything else like that. If we go down to, for example, and I don't even know if we have any, let's see if we have any curves in here. We do have some curves, and you can see I hadn't configured the curves or the radius or anything yet on this sample set here, but you can go and configure them so it's much better looking for you. It's more intuitive as far as what's going on here. That's not what this workshop's about. This workshop is about how you actually go and display this and how you use labels inside of here. While we're in here, let's look at, again, go back to the data designer and where you set up all the configurations and recognize there's a couple of really important fields as it relates to dimension labels inside of here. Again, there's the direction field, and by the way, the direction field can be configured to go in and display as directions with decimal degrees with quadrant bearings. That's how, again, that's only for display internally. And then there's your distance field. These are your normal COGO fields. Recognize that inside ArcGIS Pro, the delta field, the tangent bearing, the radial bearing are no longer stored, so they're not in here anymore. The COGO attribution has been simplified down to these actual attribute fields here: the direction, distance, radius, arc length. And then there's a new one called radius 2. Radius 2 is for a spiral curve. So they actually will store the information on a spiral curve if you've got it. Spiral curves are primarily used for railroads and limited rights of way on highways, superhighways, those sorts of things. So just know that's what the radius 2 is for. But going down, there's a couple of others fields in here which are important as far as the labeling. The first one is COGO Type. COGO Type field actually allows you to keep track of where did the COGO value come from. And we've got 3 options here. The first one is entered, in which you have actually, using one of the COGO enabled tools, you have entered the values in here, and it will store those values and mark that line as having these values being entered. The second option is from geometry. From geometry is where, in fact, you've used the update COGO values, and it has calculated what those values are. In surveying terminology, it has inversed those COGO points and determined what those values are and input those in there. So they are from the software, and they're using the geometry of that line to figure out what it is. And then finally, there's a computed value. Computed value means that you had COGO values before, but there was one of the functions went and changed that line. So you could have split the line, or you could have divided the line up, or somehow you changed the original values in which the software went and derived a new value from it. And that is what the computed value is on here. So this is the second level of important information that's on the COGO lines inside of ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. Now, COGO Type is not part of the standard COGO enabling value attribute fields in the line feature class. When you enable COGO, it's not there unless it's in a Parcel Fabric. And the Parcel Fabric keeps track of this and keeps track of what did you do and where that value come from. That is not in the others. And then there's another one down here that's been added at 3.0, I believe it was, called Label Position. Label Position, we're going to see, has another implication in that it allows it to go and keep track of, and let's look at the domain values here for COGO Position, in which, depending upon which way the line is going, you may want to have that label appear inside the polygon, which is right. Everything is stored in a clockwise direction. So on the right side of a line is inside of a polygon, and the left side of the line is outside the polygon. But the software is also going to be able to go and analyze and determine whether or not you have 2 lines there, and whether those same values are shared on both of them. And it will go and say, well, these are centered, or I think the next version of ArcGIS Pro is going to have changed the wording on that from centered into shared, meaning it's the shared dimension between there. But those 2 extra components inside of COGO enabled lines allow you to go and take those values and determine where to place them, what to do with them, and how to go and work with them. So again, there is the COGO Type attribute field here. This is the COGO Type here. And then there's also the label positioning on here. So again, there's some changes from ArcMap into Pro. All the COGO attribution is now numeric. The reason it's numeric, just to let you know, is because within Pro and within the Pro Parcel Fabric, we're beginning to start doing some analysis, some real quality checking on those values. You'll be able to say, well, What is the distance of the field? What is the distance that's stored on that COGO field? And be able to do some analysis, how much of a variance there is between those two. The same way with bearings, be able to go and analyze the difference between two bearings, be able to go and store, for example, if you've got a rotation that is appearing on a line where you've rotated it to fit inside your parcels using ground to grid or basis of bearings, or whether you're scaling it. So all of these values allow you to go and really analyze the parcels. So it'll help you with your configuration and analysis, whether or not something is a good parcel, a bad parcel. When you start doing adjustments, it allows you to go and analyze how to adjust things, if it's being automated or if it's being manually done. There's a lot built into this that was never available inside of the ArcMap data schema. All right. Once we understand that, and I should add, if there are any questions about any of those attribute fields that have been added to all of the COGO lines inside of here, are we good with that?
No questions right now.
No questions. All right. So let's look at the labeling properties, because what has happened is that inside of ArcGIS and the parcel fabric, in order to create a label, it actually has to go through and calculate what the value is, how to represent it, if it's a bearing, how to go and interpret that bearing. And there is, by the way, there is actually 3 different classes for every one of these lines. Do you want the COGO values on the right side of the line, on the left side of the line, or on the shared part of the line? And if we look at this, the SQL Server for it is whether or not the label position is null or the label position is equal to right. That's actually how it's actually looking at it and figuring out where am I going to put it, is by using a labeling class with a SQL query against it. So let's go down here and we'll examine this really closely here and look through the whole thing. This is the arcade expression. I've actually pulled it up inside of Notepad so we can look at it a lot closer. I will share with you the first couple times you look at this, it's completely daunting. It's like, what the heck is this? Because as I scroll down through it, and you can see it's an awful lot of code, and there's a lot of elements in here that it's like, how are they doing this? I want to go through all of these sections and look at it. All right, so this is an arcade expression. Just to let you know, in arcade, the double slashes, those actually are comments. So let's start with this first group here, this first sections. These are settings, and these settings will determine whether or not certain things are displayed and how they're displayed, that sort of thing. So it's this section that you're really going to pay attention to if you want to modify the way it comes out of the labeling engine. And it's real simple once you get into it. Show, for example, this first variable is called show distance, and the show distance is set to either true or false. And as they've said in the comments here, in order to show the distance field on your label, you just set it to true. By default, it's being set to true. Same way with a show direction, all right? If it's true or false. So if I set it to true, it's going to show the direction on here. So let's go and look at this. Right now, this is by default. I'm going to go down here, and by default, I'll see that my show direction is set to true. So if I tell this to go ahead and label this, automatically it will show me the direction of this, of all the lines that are set, in this case, to COGO right on the right side of it, which, by the way, is the default on here. So if I want to change this, what I have to do is just go to that setting and say, I do not wish to see that value. I don't want to see the actual bearing on here. I'll usually go and say, make sure that's valid in here, and then I'll apply it. All right. So when I apply it, I'll note that in fact, it now does not show the bearing on here. So by the way, I'm going to have to do that for both COGO left and shared. But at the same time, that's the way that this works is you go and you set that setting and it will go and actually go and display it correctly. Now, one of the things I want to make sure you understand is that when you start turning things off, because of the way the arcade expression is set up, it's leaving spaces for when you turn them on. It's setting up the label expression so it displays correctly as you've got them turned on. So for example, if we go, it's the easiest way to do this. Let's go in here and say on this line here, I'm going to select a couple lines on this line here, and I'm going to take these two lines, and I'm going to go down to label position. And you'll note by default, those are both set to right, and I'm going to make them left. And when I change them to left, all right, by the way, I've not changed the COGO left values on here to tell it don't display the bearings. So let's go back here and on COGO left, let's go ahead and reset this from the show direction from true to false and apply it. All right, it will go and not display that. So one of the things that I want to make sure you also understand is that there's often extra spaces. If we go in here and scroll all the way down to the very bottom here, where it's actually going and creating the actual, here it is here, where it's actually creating the straight line. All right. And in here, here's a direction string. It's including the direction string inside the overall string that it uses to go and automatically generate it. But what you want to make sure that you do is on here, tell it that if you've got extra spaces, remove them. Or if there's an extra line break in there, maybe there's a line break to go in and place it. Now, the script has gotten a lot better here recently, but I always go in here and I make sure that on all the label classes, I tell it to remove extra spaces in my string and extra line breaks in my string. That just makes it a cleaner label when you're going through here. So let's go back here to COGO right and tell it to remove the spaces and the lines on here. Let's go back here and change these also again. Back to COGO right. Those two lines and make them COGO right. All right, so now they'll appear as they should be. And so it makes a little bit more logical sense on here. So let's keep looking at this. So again, we've talked about showing the distances, showing the directions. These are really simple settings. But what happens if you're using a different direction type from quadrant bearings? You could actually tell it here, if you change this setting, you can change it from quadrant bearing, which is 1 for quadrant bearing. You can change it to a north azimuth, or you can change it to a south azimuth. Again, depending upon where you're going on here. Really nice. This next one these next couple ones have to do with the curve. If in fact you want to have the curve appear on this, you can tell it whether or not you want the curve or not. Let's see if we can find a curve in here. Well, here's a curve. All right. This curve here, right now, by default, it's showing me the actual radius and the arc length. A lot of people, they don't want that to appear that way. They only may want to see the arc length in here. So again, we can go into our label expression and go to that position where it says show the radius and tell it simply false. Don't show the radius, and go ahead and apply. And we can see that that one there went and disappeared on it. Let's go to the other one, which is left, show radius, make it false, and apply that. In fact, we can see that that's now disappeared on there also. So this setting here, show radius, allows us to go and set how much of the COGO that's coming out of the COGO lines actually appears. All right, that's this one here. You're going to find a lot of people, all they want is just the value on here. The next part is, what about the COGO type? The COGO type field, remember, is getting stored inside the parcel fabric line feature classes as far as whether or not it's been entered, the COGO value is entered, whether it's been from geometry using the update COGO values on here, or whether it's been changed or computed on here. And if we set this to true, if we leave it as true, it will show us those differences in different ways. If we keep it as true, it will go and show us. If we change it, let's go down here a little bit more. Let's go back to the COGO right. And if we go down here now, we can say show COGO type, change that from true to false. All right, apply that. And now let me see, where are we? And here, these are lefts there. There we go. So it will change the way it displays it. It only change it. It removes yes or not. Let's change this one here so we can see that also. False. All right, it will note, we'll go and it will remove that plus or minus in the middle of it. So it's showing all COGO values, no matter where they're derived from. This is very interesting. So you can have it display what the values are and where they came from on here. We'll look at a little bit more. So this is just, do you want to show them or not? And if you say false, it's going to completely disregard these next couple settings, which are the three settings for what does it display like when we're telling it to go and display it. So if it's entered, all right, if the COGO type is set as entered, it automatically adds a space to the front of it and to the back of it. Actually, that's not a space. That's just a normal component on here. It says don't do anything on here. However, if it's computed right now, and actually I've changed this already. This is from the back end. It actually shows it in the beginning, plus or minus. I've changed that plus or minus from the beginning to the back. I'll change it on the real live stuff, and you'll see it there. And if it's from geometry, it's actually this ampersand LT, that's the less than sign, and puts the less than sign and then the greater sign there. So it's looking at how this is set up and using that to build a string that is going to go and display out for you in here. So let's look at that a little bit more. I'm going to go back to COGO right again, which is the default one. And I'll look at the COGO type, and let's reset it back to true. All right. And then on here, I can see that this is, if it's real, if it's entered, just don't put anything in there. I could actually tell it, well, maybe I do want to make it say something like good. That's going to put a lot more characters in my text string. Maybe I don't want to do that. So I might remove that on here. So that's, again, that's if it's a good value in there, don't put anything before it or behind it. Let's go and do that. If it is computed, go ahead and apply this plus or minus on there. Okay, let's make sure that I get that in here, make sure I get it on both of these. COGO type. True. All right. And apply that because I've got some values in here. All right. Here's plus or minus. Here's computed up here. Plus or minus beforehand. All right. So let's do this a little bit. Right now, by default, it's appearing in front of it. Let's go and make it so it appears in the back. I personally like it so it appears after the number, not before the number. Let's go ahead and apply that and see how it changes it. If it does, those are probably lefts, aren't they? Sorry. Let's go back to the right. Change it to here and apply it. And we should see that change. So plus or minus in the back of it. What we're beginning to understand here, hopefully, is that the way that you use dimensions now inside the parcel fabric, you have so much more control over what you used to have. Let's keep going through this and looking at it. So here's the 3 different COGO types and the settings for those. All we have to do is set them in the expression and set it for each of those, and then they'll automatically come in there. And then we get into things like, well, what about the curve parameter? You know, if we're showing it, what's the text that we put in there? There's things such as a COGO error. If in fact we don't have complete COGO, it will show us that in different colors, whether or not there's a COGO error on there. Let's go and just create one here. Let's go in here and create a line. It's a tax line. All right. And I'm just going to go and create a tax line there. I'm going to attribute it. That attribute, all right, and this thing is actually 80 feet long. You should say 80 feet. All right. It's 80 feet long. It's just updated. And we notice, by the way, it's updated it there. It does not have a bearing on it. That bearing, because it is not a complete COGO value in here, it's showing it in red. Let's go in and let's say this is 80 degrees northeast. All right. When I go and put that on and display it, because I've turned off my direction, it's not going to show a direction. It's not going to show the text because it's not stored in here. If I were to go and take this out, go back to the 80 feet here, and then make it a COGO type of from geometry, notice it automatically goes and installs the brackets on there. When I make it from computed, it will automatically go and put the plus or minus on here. If I were to make this entered, all right, in which case it's done neither, and then go and divide this. Let's divide that line into 2 parts. It's now going to go and display this as being 40 plus or minus and 40 plus or minus. So it's going to go and automatically use the COGO values in creating that on here. Let's go and create a curve. And let's create a COGO line. And let's just do it as a curve. And let's use a radius of 50 feet on here. All right, let's finish this out. So we now have a radius of 50 feet. Let's make it exact there on here. And we have done an entered value on here. Let's go and make this label position on the right. On here, I think that I have turned off my radius in here. Let's give us a direction, a distance of 100 feet. I know that's not right, but give us 100 feet. Note, it had that this is an error because it doesn't have the arc length in here. It has a radius and it has a distance field. The distance field is from the beginning of the line to the ending of the line. That's not valid for a curve. Instead, that should be 100 feet here. All right. Now it will display correctly. So the COGO error actually here looks and analyzes the COGO values that are stored and will tell you whether or not these values that are stored are valid or COGO values, not whether they're correct, but just that there's values in those correct fields. Doesn't say that the values are correct. Again, it's just you've got values in all the fields that you need it in. That's what that setting is for. The next setting, the radius abbreviation. This is what appears if you told it to go and show the radius on here. It will appear R equals. So maybe we've told it not to show the radius, so we don't care about it. This is the radius 2 for spiral curves. This is the arc length. If we note here, it's telling us L equals 100. Well, what happens if we don't want that to appear? We can go in here, and again, we are COGO right. It's appearing on the right side. Let's go down to our arc length and tell it, let's remove that from our arc length configuration so that when it displays the arc length, it's does not going to go and put the L equals in there. When I say go ahead and apply this, it will then go and remove the L equal. So again, it's as simple as understanding what these individual variable settings are and how we can go and manipulate them to figure out what's this going to say. We have the same thing for an arc length. We have it for curve distance. If in fact, excuse me, the chord distance, if we have the chord that's going to appear, the angle abbreviation for a central angle abbreviation, if we want the central angle to appear. All right. So up until this point, we've been saying, okay, what do we want shown? You know, what do we want you to display? Now we're going to get into how do we want it to display? For example, in here, there is the distance unit rounding. Remember, on here, I went and when I went to data design and I went to fields, I told it that I want my distance here to be 2 characters. Well, the reality is it's stored in something other than that. But you tell it what you want it to display. So here I can tell it, I want my distances, whether it's the distance or the arc length or the chord length or any of those distance fields to appear, but I want them to be rounded to a certain number. So again, let's go in here and say, well, let's round everything to 3 decimal places. All right. Tell it to apply. It will then go and 3 decimal places. Oh, one more thing. Sorry. In addition to the distance rounding, there's also a number formatting. What's the format for the numbers? And in this case, this is variable, and it's going to pad this number of values in here. So this is the number format in Arcade as far as how you want to do it. And you'll note right now it's padded for 2 zeros. I'm going to make it 3 zeros here. So I've got the distance rounding to 3, and I'm going to put another 0 in there. And now is when you should see the change there. There you go. If I wanted it to be 0, if I wanted to just have integer values in there, I can tell it this, and it will just give me integer values in there. All right. Again, looks complicated, but if you go one by one, you begin to understand how this really works. And all this other code down on the bottom, that's sort of making it work, but these are the settings that you should be learning, and these are the settings that will help you figure out how to go and set up your labels. So we're down here to number format. So now we get into a new component of it, which is what are the colors that we want this thing to appear as, all right? These individual settings, what's the bearing color, what's the distance color, the radius color, the curve parameters, how do we want them going doing? What about when you only have partial COGO values in here? And this sets all the colors in here. And basically, these are the standard red, green, blue, color cyan settings on here, so that if I wanted a bearing to appear in something other than blue, by the way, this is the intensity, I could tell it, well, I want my bearings to be red instead of blue. Let me go back over here to do it, change it. If I want my direction color instead of blue to be red, I could tell it to be red. I also need to go and tell it to change my direction. Actually display that. All right, go back here. And I've told it to display my bearings in red. There it is, bearings in red. And all I have to do is set it one time there and everything else gets set all the way around. Or I can tell it, well, I really just want my bearings to be displayed in black. If I do display them, just display them in black. I'm going to set this, get this back a little bit more back to where false. We just don't want to show the bearings on here. Go ahead. So don't display the bearings. All right. We're getting closer. We're getting moving down here. So that's what these things are. These are invalid COGOs and how we want them to be displayed. And it's simple. Here's the values: red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. If you want to do more than that, you can use RGB and CYMK on here. I'm fine just using these in here. You have enough choices in here. Now, this one, this final setting is the one that's most important. And it's the one that you really don't understand until you get into this. This final setting sets the global components for what font are you using and what size is it. So with this setting, it's going to set the font for all of your bearings using these arcade expressions and the size. I know early on I went in here and I was setting the size, and I was setting it with a normal label components, setting the size of the fonts. It's like it wasn't working. What was going on? Well, it turns out that embedded inside this label expression is the font name and the size. So if I wanted to go and change this, if I wanted to make it bigger, I would go down here to get all the way down to that one there, this one right here. And I could say, I want my font size to be 8 points. And then these will now change to 8 points on my COGO right. Or I could set that to be 12 points on my COGO right on here. I can change globally just by making one little change here what all of these are set. Now you have to understand that one setting is, as they say down here in South Florida, es muy importante de los todos. It's the most important setting on this entire thing. It will go and overwrite whatever you have set on your labeling. It will overwrite it. It will automatically overwrite that for you. So if you don't want to have the setting on this label expression, you comment out that, but that's going to comment out the font name and the font size for you on here. It's also, if you comment it out, it may go and disrupt some of this on the bottom. So I wouldn't comment it out, I'll show you over here on the setting that you actually can see. I would simply go and just eliminate this here so that it doesn't go and show you anything in there. Let it automatically take over on the others. That's actually a good first step. I actually would go through and change the expression, but the reality is that one there sort of overwrites whatever you have said anywhere else. So be aware that one is very, very important. Okay. So here's the settings. Again, you really don't have to know anything else, but if you do understand how to go and set all of these settings in your labels, it becomes much easier for you to go and control and to really have real control over the dimension labels inside the parcel fabric. Let's explore a little bit more. Not a whole lot, but a little bit more. These other variables, because now it gets into some variables here that aren't quite as critical for you, but to understand how this works. So for example, when it has the COGO, these variables here, the direction field, what it's doing is this, by the way, this $ feature in Arcade, that's a global variable, and it's saying, take that feature, take that line, and pull out the direction field. Or take that line, take that feature, and pull out the distance field. So here, if in fact you had changed your schema and add a different field in which you store some of the COGO values in there, besides the standard COGO value, for example, sometimes people will bring over from ArcMap and have the names differently, or they'll have different components on there, or they'll have an extra field where they'll put something else in. You can tell it to go and pull that value out of the line, and that's the actual attribute field that it's pulling from. So these variables here, these are just setting up where is it pulling that label from on here. Here's some other programming ones. We really don't care about that much. Here's the direction string it's initially starting with. So here's where it's actually initializing these strings and setting them to not necessarily to null values, but nothing that's really in there. And then it's going through and starting to go and look at some functions, for example, whether or not it's valid. So it's looking at converting north azimuths to quadrant bearings, degrees, minutes, and seconds north. If you're interested in Arcade, there's some really interesting logic in here and how it's going through and calculating this, going through and fixing the values, making sure they're correct, whether or not there's valid COGO in here. Here's where it actually starts putting together and assembling in a variable the string. So what it's going to go and appear as on here. So if the COGO value distance is empty and it's false, you can go in and use this, rounding up the COGO distance to the distance unit rounding, and the number format that's stored up there. That's actually how it's setting what's actually stored in there for the text for the distance string. Here's where it's assembling the radius string on here. Here's the curve string that is putting together in here. Determining what to go and display, whether or not your parameters are set to the arc length or the angle or the chord, what setting you have up at the top of it. And then going in here for a straight line, how to go and assemble this. Again, very interesting. It's really nice code if you want to go and look at it a little bit more. That's the label expression. All right. Do we have any questions now before I move into sort of the next things that's built in here?
No questions right now.
Okay.
I just had a quick question, actually. Just let's say you wanted to add an acronym, or not an acronym, but like an M for meters or FT for feet to the end of the distance. How would you do that?
So are you trying to do that on the expression label or on the actual information that's shown internally to you?
Just on the label.
Okay, so on the label here, you can tell it there's a setting in here regarding, because you could actually set something that's not correct in here. Let's do it here. Do it down here. I'll show you real simple. If I wanted to go and set and change what appears in the direction string, all right, I could tell it plus and then M if I want it to be meters or feet. So this string is pulling together this right here. This is where it's assembling a text value for the COGO distance that's stored, and it is rounding it up to this setting and is filling it out with this setting. And then we're telling it at the end of that string to go and add an M to it. That's what this is. Outside the parameter, I'm telling it plus add an M, a text of M on the end of it. All right. That's how I would do it. It would overwrite it for everything. If you wanted to pull it out of the value of what it is, if you've got some of them being meters, some of them being feet, some of them being chains, is that what you're asking?
No, that was what I was asking for.
That
just
was
this
it. Okay.
particular example. Yeah. I
Yeah.
did have another question though, because let's say that in my data model, all the distances are in meters, but I'd like to temporarily show a label of what those distances are in feet. I had asked this question in an Ezra webinar, and I think they said that I needed to actually go to the distance variable and just multiply it by the factor, whatever that factor would be.
So that's
Would that be
actually
right?
up in here. That's actually up in here in the settings in which this distance. So if you're storing this in a certain value, how deep do you want to go? If you're storing it in this value, this is what's being represented back to you as far as the value. And if you have this stored as feet and it's displaying it as feet when it goes and displays it to you, if you want to go and display it as a different value, a different equivalency, all right, you would then go and multiply this times, for example, we had feet and we wanted to display meters in here, you would go and multiply this by the equivalency. So how do you find the equivalency? Let's go in here. And I think they actually did show you this. If we go to the units and we look at the direction units, all right, here's a dirty little secret. And that everything inside of Pro is stored in meters. However, when you set it, for example, to feet, it's actually multiplying it times 0.3048 so that it's taking that meter and figuring out what the equivalency is for feet, and that's what it's representing back to you. All right. So yes, in the label expression, you would multiply it times that to get the value. Actually, that you multiply it times that to get from meters to feet. So feet to meters, you want to do the inverse of that. All right. But interestingly, again, everything that's stored in here is stored as a meter, but then it's giving you the equivalency similar to what Microsoft Excel does with numbers. They're all stored in a single format, and then you tell it what that format is supposed to represent. That's also how they can go and put things such as chains and yards and perches and all these other obscure surveying distances in here. If I go in here and add, for example, a chain, all right, just a regular chain, it will tell me that a chain is 20.11 meters long. It's always the equivalency that it's actually putting in there. Does that help you, Heather?
It does. Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Mark wants to know the difference feet and US feet. Don't let Mark There's a whole big thing. Know that for most of our mapping, we can use normal US feet, but there is a slight difference between, well, let's go there. I know that Mark wasn't actually asking the difference, but there's US feet, and you can see how far out that's pulled. This is the US survey foot designation, and this is the normal foot designation. And you can see it's out there at 4 and 5 decimal places where you start seeing a difference between these two. It's the difference between the internationally observed foot and what the actual measurement is and what the US standardized foot is. It's an abbreviated version of it there. Unless you're doing very large projects, it's not going to make much difference for you. For most cadastral mapping, there isn't a whole lot of difference, but if you're starting to do some geodetic surveying or some large areas, that will make a difference on here. All right, so what's different? He wants to know the difference between foot. Okay. So any other questions about this? I just saw Zach came on. Zach, if you want to stick around, we can talk about some of the options. Zach had asked me earlier about how he wants to do something different with this. And so it's going to take a little bit more than just changing this. You're actually going to have to do this and do some working around it. But we can do some pretty amazing things with this expression in here, on here. All right. Any other questions on this? If not, we've got a couple more things we want to cover before we're done with this workshop. All right. So here's the things that we want to cover. Let's go in here. By the way, let's discard these changes here. All right. So we have some things to look at here. Those are the settings. That's the expressions that we use. So the question is, well, how do we get the correct setting as far as which side of the line these labels actually appear on? And it turns out that actually inside ArcGIS Pro 3.1, Esri has put together a set parcel label position on here. All right. This will go and analyze and take its best shot at figuring out where things should go on here. And basically, you can either have a selection set or you can go through everything in here and you can tell it to go ahead. In this case, you can see I have very few in here. But it will go through and look at not necessarily the lines, but it will look at the records and analyze the records and the lines associated with the records to figure out where a label should be placed relative to that record on here. And you can go and run it. And that's the set parcel line position on this. I'm not even sure it's going to change any of these on here because I think I'd run this before. So it will go and determine whether or not currently a label has been placed outside of a record. It will by default put it into the right side, which is the default setting, so that the label appears inside of the record on here. And it will go through and analyze this. The shared records, by the way, they should be things like these lots in here, but that's one single record when I built that. If they were individual tax parcels next to one another and they had the same values, that would appear as being a single. Let's turn these off. We don't need these as a shared information on here. So that's the parcel line label position. And once they're all set, as far as what the software thinks we should do, you can go in here and change them all you want. All right. You don't have to use that setting anymore. That's sort of one of the first in here. But the second one, and this one is very interesting. There's a tool that was introduced as a beta tool back in 2.9 that's actually available in 3.0 called Reconstruct Boundaries. Now, this Reconstruct Boundaries really is not, doesn't have to do anything with sort of the record and reducing it to seed and rebuilding it from seeds. That's sort of this reconstruct from seeds and shrink to seeds. Those are components here. This Reconstruct Boundary is a sort of superset of this quality-driven workflow of merge boundaries, and that the Reconstruct from boundaries will work with selected parcels, and it will analyze the lines associated with those selected parcels and determine whether or not they're straight lines or whether or not they should, multiple lines should be replaced by a single line. And this is commonly called the backlot problem, in which you have a series of lines that are split. And you'll see that this parcel right here has 1, 2, 3, 4 different lines, each of them being 200. And it may have been that it was built here to here to here to here. Well, that probably was described as being one single line, but previous construction techniques had it split into different lines. Could have been coverage, could have been, you know, a previous data structure that required that it all be split. It's not required anymore. So that this Reconstruct Boundary here, this Reconstruct Boundaries tool, allows you to go and select part. Well, you saw it that quickly. It goes and takes your selected parcels, analyzes the lines associated with those selected parcels, and determines whether or not they're all one line. And if they are all one line, it makes them one line, and it combines the COGO values in there. So let me undo this. Let me go and undo this. All right. And you should then see the 200s in here. These are 4 lines in here, just to prove it. Let's go and take this parcel. Let's go and activate this record. Let's go and just say, only show the current records in here. And we can see that there are 4 distinct lines in here for that one record. Let's turn that off. And we can actually take that one and just say, let's go ahead and so to show the dimensions in here. Let's go ahead and reconstruct the boundaries for that. And it will go and take those, combine them all, and give you the new COGO value for those lines. So it's a way to go and replace those. By the way, if we were to go in here and do this now, you can see that's one line. That's not 4 lines in there anymore. So it's a way to clean up your previous mapping if it required that it was all split up anytime there was any intersection along the line. Things like that used to happen a lot in ArcMap Parcel Fabric and in previous iterations of some of the ArcMap data schemes. So that tool, something that it doesn't get talked a lot, but it's a really nice tool if you want to clean up against this. You must have parcels selected though. And then what it is doing is taking those parcels, looking through all the lines associated with those records, and then analyzing whether or not they should, those lines should be merged together. And then the difference between that and merge points is merge boundaries. Merge boundaries does not add the COGO values up. Reconstruct boundaries does. It looks at the COGO values and actually calculates what those COGO values, the aggregated COGO values are. All right. Are there any questions on here that we address?
None in the chat.
All right, let's go ahead and hopefully this was informative. And if you want to, let's stick around and talk. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple weeks at the next workshop. Thank you. Thanks for attending. and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.